So today I'm doing an acrylic painting in my sketchbook. I wanted to switch up the materials a little bit, but I'm still using the same concepts I've been working on. I'm still starting out with burnt sienna. I'm watering it down a little bit to make it thin for my underpainting. And I'm just setting up my drawing here using lines and shapes. Thinking about composition, sticking pretty close to the photo reference, but still I'm trying to find gesture in the skull and skeleton and thinking about positive and negative space. I want to get everything in the right spot and keep it accurate to the reference, but at the same time I want a dynamic composition. So you can see I'm trying to sum up some of these straight lines versus some of these curved arcing lines, looking for those dynamic relationships between these lines and shapes. So if you've ever done gesture drawing, think about the underpainting stage as like a gesture drawing stage for your painting. It's always a good way for me to think about my composition and how to have intention with the composition. Even if it's not easy to describe in words, these quick gestural marks kind of help us figure out what we want to accomplish in this painting. So a lot of these marks are some of the most important in the whole painting. Even if they get covered in layers of paint and we don't see them in the finished product, they're still in there and they're still important. So take your time with this part. It's okay to be loose, but remember, loose doesn't necessarily mean careless. So I'm still using burnt sienna, and I'm starting to think about value. And my focus today is going to be shape versus form. So it's similar to what we've been talking about with edges and value. I'm making this two value statement with burnt sienna. The white of the paper is the light shape, and this thin wash of burnt sienna is my dark shape. So I'm mapping out my shadow shapes, mapping out my light shapes. And the main difference between shape and form that I want to talk about today is that a shape is two-dimensional. It's an abstraction. It's not really meant to show depth or meant to look real. It's a flat shape on the surface of our painting. A form is meant to be three-dimensional. It's meant to represent three-dimensional space and show depth. And if we learn to bounce between the two, back and forth, it can create a lot of contrast between realism or representationalism and abstraction. Because we never really have to choose one or the other. I think you can make a pretty interesting painting by having both. So here I'm mixing a light shape. And it might be confusing that I have acrylic paint on my palette here. It's the same palette I'm using for my oil paintings. So that paint you see on the outside that I'm usually using is my oil paint. And then those piles of paint inside of that is the acrylic paint. I'm just using the same palette just to make it easy. But I have titanium white, cadmium yellow, cadmium red, burnt sienna. I have a dark purple there in the corner that I may or may not use. And then I have ultramarine blue. So my acrylic painting palette is a little bit different, but all the same concepts still apply. my paint is still set up according to value and temperature, going from light to dark and from warm to cool. But you can totally do this painting in oil paint on a canvas or on a panel. I just like switching up the materials a little bit in case anyone's using only acrylic paint this semester. But even if you're used to oil paint and you want to try acrylic, it's always good to change it up a little bit and see how it affects your process and your thinking and the way you're seeing what you're seeing. So the shadow shapes are pretty cool. They have like a greenish tint to them. So I'm excited to see how that goes up against some of those warmer tones of the burnt sienna. I'm mixing a dark shadow shape and then one step up in value for some of those midtones where the light shape is meeting the dark shape. I remember, since the skull itself is pretty light, it's like the color of the bone of the skull, even some of the darker shadow shapes are still pretty light. If you look on my palette compared to that purple in the corner, this green color that we're using for this shadow shape is still pretty close to a mid-tone. So think of it like a cool mid-tone. So here I'm adjusting the temperature a little bit. I'm going a little bit warmer. So when we add red to green, remember red is a complement of green. When we add the complement to a color, it's bringing it closer to gray. Remember, experiment how you can shift your temperatures within your shadow shapes and your light shapes just as much as you shift the values. So here I'm kind of exploring how I can just kind of turn the dials on my shadow shape here, going from warm to cool. It's a really subtle shift. It's not a very warm shadow here. It's just a little bit less cool. It's a little bit less green because I added that red. And so just like we were talking about form shadows versus cast shadows and how that dictates hard edges versus soft edges, think about that and how you can show form versus shape. In a way, it's just a different way of describing the same thing we talked about last week. It's just a slightly different way of thinking about it. Instead of thinking about hard edges versus soft edges, think about how you can decide whether this is more of a smoothly rendered form that has depth to it and it's more of a three-dimensional form versus a flat abstract shape. I encourage everyone to paint as realistically as they want, but I want to give you the option to explore that abstraction within the realism that you're practicing. So I mixed up a gray for the background. It's a little too dark, so I'm going to add some white. I know this gray background isn't the most exciting thing, but I want to keep it simple just so I can really focus on those edges that we talked about last week and use that background to cut out the shape of the foreground. I'm using negative space to define the positive space. The more we keep things simple, the more closely we can look at a lot of these relationships that we've been talking about. And a simple painting can become pretty complicated. Which I think is fun. I hope you do too. And if you look at the photo reference, this skull shape will make more sense. This was the classroom skeleton at a school that I worked at, and the top part of the skull was kind of broken and like pushed back away from the rest of the skull, and I just like the shapes. So if it seems a little misshapen, that's because it is. So keep the background pretty simple and focus on those edges that we talked about last week. If you look at like a sharp plane, like the bridge of the nose, having like a harder edge because it's a quicker transition versus the top of the skull is going to be like a smoother, rounder transition. So when I go in and paint that light shape later, I'm going to smooth that out. And I'm going in and getting that negative space beneath the clavicle near the neck. But that idea of shape versus form is being worked out right from that underpainting. Once I started looking at composition and value, I'm thinking about shape versus form. And if you look at the cast shadows in the eye socket or in the nasal cavity, they're pretty clear-cut shapes. They're flat graphic shapes versus the form shadow on the back of the skull towards the top right of the painting. That's going to be a smoother transition from light to dark. That's going to be more of a form. And again, this totally overlaps with what we talked about with edges last week, with the form shadow versus the cast shadow dictating a softer edge versus a harder edge. This is just a slightly different way of looking at that. We're calling it shape versus form. When we use those words, shape versus form, it allows us to see our painting as being both abstract and representational. So here I'm mixing up my light shape, the color of the skull getting hit directly with light. The relationships between the shapes shape versus form, it's really going to get worked out where the light and dark meet in the midtones. So right here, I'm still just massing in these bigger shapes. Like when I squint, everything I see that getting hit with light when I squint is what I'm focusing on here. I'm using a pretty big brush for the size of this painting. Just big enough that I can fit within that shape. Just gonna shift this light shape a little bit more yellow though. So I'm trying to maintain the value, but just change the temperature just a little bit. And if you want to use the white of the paper or the white of the canvas underneath as part of the light shape, that's totally fine too. One thing I should mention about the teeth here, a lot of times with student work, when we paint skulls, everyone gets hung up on the teeth and they try to go in and paint all the individual teeth right from the start. Think about that whole part of the mouth as like a sphere getting hit with light. Don't worry about individual teeth right now. We don't have to go in and illustrate all those tiny little lines. For this stage, we're just kind of blocking in our light shapes and our shadow shapes. Just think about what you see when you squint. Squinting helps edit out a lot of those details that aren't as necessary. We want to build a strong foundation and then lay those details on top of it later. So as the painting looks right now, this is pretty much what I see when I'm squinting, right? It's a light shape, a shadow shape, and the background. Simple but accurate. So you can see on that corner of the jaw right there, I'm showing a little bit of form just as a smoother transition. Same thing with where that form shadow on the back of the cranium there on the back of the skull. It's a smoother transition compared to the cheekbone or the bridge of the nose or that cast shadow of the eye socket. So think about those hard versus soft edges as the beginnings of shape versus form. I'm going in and pushing some of those highlights a little bit. Don't get too excited about highlights too early. And so now I'm finally going to go and try and mix a mid-tone here. by mixing some light shape and some shadow shape. I put in a tiny bit of red to give it a little bit more chroma. So think about how the light is transitioning from light to dark and how that's going to increase the saturation. So think about warm versus cool. If you have warm light shapes, maybe you want cooler shadow shapes. And think about what your mid-tone is going to do to those. But notice how just by putting that mid-tone in between the light shape and the shadow shape is going to start turning the form, even though I'm not going in and making it super smooth. It's just enough information to trick our brain into thinking that our eyes are seeing a three-dimensional form, which is really at the heart of what we're doing when we try to paint representationally. But when we're aware of it and we can kind of play with that concept, it can make for some interesting paint. So think about that as you're painting. Ask yourself, do I render this out perfectly and smoothly, or do I let the paint be paint and just kind of sit there as an abstract shape? Maybe the paint is thicker in one area and thinner in another area. See what you can get away with. Maybe you can push it a little bit too far and then dial it back later. I recommend using a brush that's just a little bit larger than you're comfortable using, because that's going to force you to think more about shapes and less about rendered forms. But again, see what you can get away with as far as showing us every realistic form possible. Maybe you don't have to. Maybe you can get away with some more abstract shapes. Because when we're aiming for realism, remember that more information isn't always the best answer. But you don't want to tell us every single piece of the story. You want to get it down just to bare bones. If you've ever told and retold a story more than once, you get to know which parts of the story you don't always need and which details of the story are necessary to get the effect that you want. The more you retell a story, it evolves over time and you end up with the perfect distillation of all the words that describe what happens. We can do that with paint too. Don't show us everything that you're seeing, just show us what's important. Because this is still storytelling. We're just using lines and shapes and colors instead of words or phrases and sentences. So give yourself room for that kind of give and take. As I'm painting here, I'm especially right here in this area right here with the teeth, I might make something more detailed, more rendered looking, and then I might paint over it again, simplifying it. Just kind of turning the dials, testing things out, seeing what I can get away with, abstracting stuff. and I might cross and recross that threshold a bunch of times. So yeah, I just gotta remix some more background color, just because it's good to let yourself kind of go beyond the edges of the shape or form that you're painting, knowing that you're gonna go back in and kind of re-establish that edge with that adjacent shape. So here it's the background versus the foreground, or the background versus the positive shape of the skull, especially in that area of the teeth. I'm using the background to go in and redraw that. It's not quite the same gray that I had before, and that's okay. I'm not too worried about that. Sometimes it's nice to just let the painting have some history. If some of that first layer of the gray comes through beneath this newer layer, that I think that's okay. And you'll notice by going back and forth between the positive and negative space, or just between the two shapes that are up against each other, I can create really sharp lines without using a tiny brush. That line across the top of the skull right there is created by two shapes next to each other. So every time we draw a line, we're creating a shape on either side, but we can also create lines by putting two shapes next to each other, which is also a good habit to get into if you're using larger brushes like this. If you're trying to break a habit of going to tiny brushes too quickly, just know that you can always get a really thin line by putting two large shapes next to each other, almost touching. You're kind of sandwiching the shapes together, and that paint can even get kind of pushed out between them. If you've ever seen a Wayne Thiebaud painting up close, he wasn't using tiny brushes for those marks. So I'm getting into a little bit of that purple now. I'm going in and just messing with some of those temperature shifts within the shadow shape. I don't love that mark I just made, so remember, I'm not trying to deviate too much with my values here because I like what I had. I'm just trying to play with the temperatures a little bit. So a little bit less green, a little bit more blue. We'll see what happens. And so here I'm going in and pushing some of those highlights further. Especially with the teeth. Remember, we don't have to get too detailed with the teeth and draw in every shape that we see there. We can just kind of build a couple of teeth out of paint. Just all these different planes on the skull we can kind of describe with the paint itself. Sometimes when I'm painting, it almost feels like a sculpture made out of paint, like it's cake frosting or something. But it doesn't have to be thick paint everywhere, because if the paint is thick across the whole painting, then none of it is, in a way. So it's just another form of contrast, having thick versus thin. But you can see this paint I'm putting on now, it's like just a little bit brighter than the paint beneath it in those light shapes, which is just giving it a little bit of extra dimension, a little bit more form, rounding out the top of that skull. Don't cover up your whole light shape with a highlight. Anytime you're putting in your lightest light or your darkest dark, pretend that those colors are expensive. Because if we get too much highlight or too much super dark shadow, it's going to flatten things out. Most of the interesting stuff in a painting like this is in the midtones, which is also the most difficult. Painting a highlight or painting a super dark shadow is easy. You just make it brighter or darker than everything else. It's the midtones that are confusing and that take the most time and can also be the most beautiful. We think of really beautiful paintings sometimes as being a really bright highlight or a really saturated color, but for me it's usually just a well-placed gray. But that takes a lot of practice. I just screwed up that shadow. That's a little bit too bright. So I'm going back again, remix that shadow. That greenish, grayish that I started with. There's that saying that writing is mostly rewriting. I'm going to say that painting is mostly repainting, at least for me. I know some painters can nail it on the first try and walk away. That's not me. I think even if I do nail it on the first try, I just have to stick around and screw it up. Even if I find my way back to where I started. The last few minutes of this painting, I think, is a good example of some of the least exciting parts of a painting sometimes take the most time. I think some of those highlights on the front of the skull are my favorite parts of the painting, and that was easy, and I got it on the first try. And these dark midtones next to darker midtones within the shadow shape are just the hardest to find for me for some reason. So don't beat yourself up about that if that's what you're dealing with. So as you navigate your way through this painting, continue to think about everything we've been thinking about. Value versus temperature, composition and lines versus shapes, hard edges versus soft edges, and how to handle your brush and your paint to control those things. But start thinking about shape versus form, abstraction versus realism. Despite what your photo reference might tell you, or even your own eyes, and what reality's telling you, it's your painting and you're in control of the shapes and the paint, all of it. Don't get dragged around by what the camera saw. The painting belongs to you, it's your statement, and you can own that and do whatever you want with it. Which I know is an obvious thing to say, but it matters even in the slightest, smallest decisions we make on our palette and on the surface of our painting. It's important to practice these representational skills, make things look real, but it's also important to ignore those impulses sometimes and throw on some thick paint, some abstract shapes for the sake of the composition. So don't be afraid of those trade-offs. Play with it and have fun and see where that takes you. And if you start to spin your wheels, that's okay. That's what we're here to do. If you make a bad painting and you grow and learn a lot, I'll definitely take that over making a perfect painting that was easy and that you didn't learn from, because we are here to learn. I think most of what I learned here today is that acrylic can be really challenging. But have fun with it. I'm excited to see what you make.